Right, so welcome. This is our second question and answer video. Some good questions today, so I'll try to get right to them. The first question dealt with the most visible manifestation of the Jim Crow state constitutions, which were these efforts to restrict the voting rights of African Americans. So a couple of questions here. What percentage actually passed the series of assessments, and did middle class or wealthy Southern Black families challenge the restrictions, especially in states like Louisiana or later in the as we move into the 20th century, Georgia, where there is some political and economic power for Black families, or in Louisiana, you do have this kind of mixed race class. Both of these are excellent questions. Let's go back to the chart here. This shows the number of African Americans in each of these states as Jim Crow was initiated. And you have to keep in mind a couple of things here. First, the 15th Amendment said that states could not explicitly impose racial restrictions. So a state that passed a law saying all Black people cannot vote in our state, or all mixed race people cannot vote in our state, that would have been unconstitutional even by the Supreme Court that we were looking at in the snippets this week, which is this very, very conservative court. So states have to get creative. And secondly, because of that constitutional prohibition, perversely, there's a need for states to ensure that they at least have some Blacks who are registered as a result of things like the poll tax here. So the numbers. In a state like Louisiana, the drop-off was almost complete. It was a 99% reduction in Black voting, Black ability to vote there, so that by the end of the implementation of the Jim Crow Constitution, it was just over 1,000 African Americans out of a total population of 652,000 Blacks who were able to vote. In some southern states, Texas, for instance, the percentage was a little bit higher, but again, not much. This was the general pattern, 2 or 3% maximum in terms of African Americans' ability to vote. And there were no meaningful legal challenges by middle class Black interests, in part because it was seen as feudal, and in part because the NAACP, which is formed in 1909, is focused really on other things, especially, political and non-political violence, and they see that as as the first measure approach. One other thing that's important to keep in mind with regards to these restrictions relating to the first question of what percent of African Americans actually passed a series of assessments, there was also in each of these states a chunk of white voters who would not pass the assessments. The primary purpose of these assessments was to disenfranchise Blacks, but a secondary favorable outcome for the white political establishment in these southern states was an ability to knock off the rolls a segment of poor white voters as well, who might be inclined to support left-wing candidates on economic issues that might challenge the economic status quo in the late 19th and early 20th century South. So this is a period of simply massive disenfranchisement that, for all practical purposes, eliminates Black voting in the South, but also substantially reduces the white electorate in the region. Second question, set of questions, dealt with the political violence side of this issue. Which offenses are mostly committed that resulted in lynching? And I thought Black people were the only ones who were lynched. Why would a white person be lynched? Both excellent questions. We'll go back to the chart for the South, and you see here, even in the South, there are tiny numbers of whites who are lynched. The smallest is in South Carolina with 3. But there are lynchings that occur throughout the United States in every region of the country except for the Northeast, where the principle never permeates. The South has by far the most lynchings, but the second most lynchings in the U.S. are in the West. And those who are lynched in the West are are overwhelmingly white, and these lynchings are very different than the southern lynchings. The western lynchings tend to be extrajudicial. So the offenses there, relating to the first question, of offenses mostly committed in a lynching, might be cattle rustling or murder, where there's this sense that, well, the perpetrator is not going to be brought to justice, so we'll give him frontier justice. And of course, the problem with this is, what happens if the alleged perpetrator is innocent? But that's that's the nature of lynching in the West, and those who are lynched in the West are, as I said, overwhelmingly white. In the South, as you can see from the chart, those who are lynched are overwhelmingly African American. And to me, really, the only way to view lynching in the South is this is political violence. The purpose here is not simply to murder an African American, but to send a message to any African American that, look, if you step outside of the norm, if you challenge the establishment, you may wind up being publicly executed as well. But generally, lynchings are tied to, if not outright crimes, because oftentimes the crimes are just invented, but to specific kinds of crimes, murder and especially rape. And the idea here is that lynching is necessary to protect, white women from, from black men attacking them. It's a very racialized and genderized sense of violence. The whites who were lynched in the South often are people who in some way try to come to the assistance of a black person who's about to be lynched, or are opponents of lynching. I mean, there's an ideological or political element even in the white lynchings in the South. But lynching, it's a shameful aspect of American history, but it's a part of U.S. history even beyond the South, well into the 20th century. A couple of questions on the issue of Supreme Court reversing, which I think these are excellent questions, and they get to it's a good issue to think of, for those of you who are teachers when you teach the Supreme Court. So the first question deals with the insular cases, and this was a bad decision, and it was, but how is it that the decision could never have been reversed? And then the second question, more broadly, is how can you get decisions that are wrong? How can they remain in good standing if some of the decisions go against the Constitution? And the backdrop to this, and it's worth keeping in mind, that the U.S. Supreme Court is different than Supreme Courts in at least some other democracies. There are countries, including Western democracies, that allow for so-called advisory opinions. That is, the political branches can go to the Supreme Court and say, we are thinking of doing X. We're thinking of passing a law that will say that Brooklyn College has the right to seize the surrounding neighborhood and build buildings in this neighborhood. We want you, the Supreme Court, to tell us whether this law is constitutional. The U.S. system does not work this way. It works on a system from the Constitution, Article 3, which says that the federal courts can only hear matters in which there is a live case and a live controversy. That is, so take the Trump cases from this past term, the last decisions of the Supreme Court. So the controversy here was the House had subpoenaed Trump's financial records. Trump didn't want to give them over. Trump said that the subpoenas were illegal, so the courts had to decide one way or the other. Let's say if instead the House had decided, we're not sure whether these are constitutional or not, so we're going to go to court and ask the court for a judgment about whether these are constitutional. In that case, the case would not have made it into court at all. Why is this relevant to these questions here? That means that when the Supreme Court has these kind of really bad decisions, they can't willy-nilly reverse them. They have to find a way to reverse them only in the context of other cases that come before the Supreme Court. With regards to the insular cases, one of the reasons why they've never quite been reversed is that they've largely, but not exclusively, not entirely, but they've largely been neutered. So there is a sense, for instance, that the 14th Amendment now applies to the territory. So, for instance, during the debate over same-sex marriage, Puerto Rico's ban over against gay and lesbian people marrying was challenged in the U.S. federal courts, and the First Circuit, which has jurisdiction over Puerto Rico as well as New England states, struck down Puerto Rico's law. And their argument was the Supreme Court has decided, in Windsor and then later in Obergefell, that gay and lesbian couples have a right to marry. Puerto Rico is part of the United States, therefore this right extends to gay and lesbian couples in Puerto Rico. And this really isn't consistent with the insular cases, but that aspect of them has largely gone has gone aside. But there are some aspects, for instance, shipping restrictions into U.S. colonies like Puerto Rico, which remain in place, where there are greater rights that, say, a business in the United States will have to contract with foreign shipping than a business in Puerto Rico would. In terms of how can a case be in good standing if they clearly go against the Constitution, the classic example here is Korematsu. So that's the decision in World War II where the Supreme Court says it's okay for the government to intern American citizens of Japanese ancestry simply because they are Japanese ancestry of Japanese ancestry. So they're if these Japanese Americans who were taken from California, from Washington, from Oregon, and from Arizona, and are resettled into concentration camps in the Rocky Mountain states. And this is a decision which is almost at the time recognized as a travesty, and by the 1950s is seen as a shameful era in the history of the Supreme Court. But of course, the issue of how can the Supreme Court overturn it? Well, there aren't other examples of United States government policies taking U.S. citizens and putting them into concentration camps and then having those challenged. So because there wasn't a live case or controversy to allow the Supreme Court to reconsider Korematsu, it technically remained on the books until the Trump era, even though Congress had formally apologized for the internment and everyone recognized that they were wrong. So the backdrop to here, where the decision finally is reversed, is the Muslim ban, immigration ban cases, where Trump's ban is challenged by the state of Hawaii and a coalition of other blue states. Supreme Court upholds the immigration ban. Legally, I think correctly. The argument that the majority of the court makes is that the executive traditionally in immigration issues has extraordinary deference, and as long as the executive can come up with some plausible reason for its policies, it's not the job of the court to intervene. But the dissent in this case, this was a 5-4 decision, argues that this is comparable to Korematsu, and that basically what the Supreme Court is doing is reaffirming Korematsu. And because the dissent raised the issue, the Supreme Court, this is an opinion from Justice Roberts, chooses to use the occasion to explicitly reverse Korematsu. The key line here, Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided, has been overruled in the court of history, but Justice Roberts, who wrote this decision, concedes not by the Supreme Court yet, and to be clear, has no place in law under the Constitution. So this last clause formally overturns Korematsu. But until this issue could be raised in the context of a live case or controversy before the Supreme Court, technically Korematsu remained good law. So it's one of the oddities of the U.S. System. Now, the flip side here is something like Plessy versus Ferguson, which we looked at in the snippets. That's explicitly reversed in Brown versus Board of Education. So the same issue is before the court both times. Can states legally segregate Black and white people? In Plessy, it says yes. In Brown, it says no, and because it says no in Brown, it has to say we're explicitly reversing Plessy. And then just a couple of quickie questions with which to end. Is the Comstock Act still accepted today? If so, is that why the government or school district can ban a piece of literature from the curriculum or libraries if they deem it offensive? Um, Mostly no. The Comstock Act itself is gone, and it's undermined by a series of 1960s decisions called the obscenity cases. Most of these are 5-4 decisions. They're very liberal decisions that dramatically weaken obscenities laws. So these laws remain on the books in all 50 states, but they're much more difficult to enforce. Now, the government, in some cases can ban pieces of literature from libraries. When they do so, invariably the ACLU challenges, and usually in those cases, if you look at how they wind up coming out, the government loses. So technically, yes, they have this right, but it's difficult to enforce because the Supreme Court has so dramatically narrowed the scope of the of obscenities legislation. So, the nudes versus the prudes thing that we looked at in the snippets, that would be fine today. Curriculum is a somewhat different issue. So with curriculum, government has significant powers over the curriculum. So the issue is which specific government entity is banning a piece of literature. If it's a locality, traditionally city governments, town governments have jurisdiction over over educational policies. Almost always that is going to be constitutional. There are rare instances where it would not, but localities have considerable flexibility here. If it's the state or especially the federal government doing the banning, then that gets to trickier questions, and those almost always are going to yield challenges. And even at the local level, I mean, you see this all the time. There'll be a local school district that will ban, Catcher in the Rye or some sort of mainstream book, and usually it will be challenged. Sometimes they'll win, sometimes they'll lose in these cases, and oftentimes that will depend on the specifics of state or city law. And then the question of naturalization, which is an important one, which we'll get more to when we get to the 20th century. One of the important things for this period that we're looking at today, pre 1920, is that apart from the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is an important exception, but nonetheless is confined to a single ethnic group, immigration to the United States is unlimited. There are no legal barriers on it. Until we get to World War I. Then restrictions start to come in. The U.S. passes an short-term immigration restrictions laws in 1919, again in 1921, and then a major immigration restriction law in 1924. So before that time, naturalization generally meant, you're in as long as, you pass a health screening test at Ellis Island or whatever the immigration facility was that you happened to pass into the United States. And in the 19th century, there were large numbers of people who would move back and forth between the U.S. and their home countries, especially in Europe, but also a significant component of the Chinese immigrants would work for a time in the United States and then go back to China. So debates that we're having today about naturalization, these are really alien to the 14th Amendment because they're the 14th Amendment as it is created in the 1860s, because at this point the presumption is that anyone who comes into the United States is has the opportunity to become a citizen because there were no legal barriers. Post 1924, of course, this changes, and so the DACA, which we'll sort of get to at the end of the course, is a tricky issue because it deals with this highly unusual class of citizens, people who came to the United States, people who were brought to the United States as children, who entered the United States without immigration documents, but who have remained in the United States in good standing for, for years, and in some cases for decades. And the question before the courts, and the courts have so far skirted this issue. They've decided DACA on technical grounds rather than sort of the heart of the issue. Is if you have a system where people are brought, if you have a system where you have an undocumented immigrant who comes to the United States and has a child, and that child is born in the United States, that child is a U.S. citizen. Full stop. So why should that be any different if you're dealing with a child who happens to come to the United States 4 or 5 days after its birth, and then lives in the United States for 20 years, has no connection to whatever country it happened the child happened to be born in, and the court is sort of inching, it seems to me, towards an eventual ruling saying that in those circumstances, there's at least an implied right of naturalization. One other thing though that I think is important to remember at the DACA cases, and that makes them trickier cases constitutionally, is that DACA, as it was designed by the Obama administration, did not simply say that these children, again, many of whom had lived their entire lives in the United States, should not be unfairly deported, but that it gave them certain other rights. So, for instance, work permits, some sort of limited access to welfare benefits and these sorts of things. So basically, the idea was we're not going to treat these kids or people who came to the U.S. as kids as citizens, but we're going to give them some rights. And there is a question about whether the executive can do that unilaterally, or whether the executive needs legislation to be able to do that. And people, I think, of good faith disagree over that question. But the naturalization debate over DACA is unusually interesting, because we're dealing with a class of people who, in effect, did not exist in 1868 when the 14th Amendment is passed, because immigration restrictions did not exist at that time. So that's about all we have for Q&A for this week. Hope that I got to your question. If not, keep submitting them, and I'll try to get some other students' questions next time. But these were excellent questions, and again, I realize this is a stressful period, so I really appreciate the efforts everyone is putting together for the class. And I will see you on Monday.